Right now, nearly 8 out of 10 people in South Korea want their own nuclear weapons.
Yeah, which is staggering.
It really is. I mean, in a country that has relied entirely on the United States nuclear umbrella for, well, over 70 years, that number shouldn't just surprise you. It should honestly terrify you.
Absolutely.
Because 76.2% is not some, fringe political movement. That is a massive tectonic shift in their national psychology.
Right.
And it forces us to ask a very uncomfortable question. What exactly broke the alliance so badly that South Korea is suddenly, ready to build the bomb?
It's the definition of a quiet crisis, I think.
Yeah.
It's the kind of geopolitical shift that doesn't make the front page every single day, mostly because everyone is, looking at the explosive front lines in Europe or the Middle East right now.
Right, the loud conflicts.
Exactly. But 10 years from now, historians are going to point to this exact moment in the Asia-Pacific and say, well, that was the turning point. That was when the fundamental architecture of the world map actually changed.
And that is exactly our mission today. So welcome to this deep dive.
Glad to be here.
Today, we are taking a massive stack of geopolitical analyses, defense articles, international economic data, and strategic white papers. And we're unpacking them to understand the structural mechanics of what is actually happening in the Asia-Pacific.
The real gears behind the machine.
Exactly. Basically, we're asking, is the U.S. fundamentally losing its Asian allies? And look, before we jump into the weeds here, I want to be completely upfront with you, the listener.
Yeah, this is an important disclaimer.
We are going to be talking about incredibly polarizing figures today, specifically Donald Trump and the policies of his second term, as well as highly sensitive, ongoing military conflicts like the U.S. war with Iran.
Right, which naturally raises questions about how we analyze these events without getting bogged down in domestic politics.
Exactly. And our approach today is strictly 100% analytical. We are not here to debate the morality of these policies. We aren't taking sides in any elections, left-wing or right-wing. And we certainly aren't taking sides in any overseas conflicts. Our only job today, is to look purely at the physics of geopolitics.
Right, cause and effect.
Yeah. When Washington pulls a highly controversial lever, what mathematically, economically, and strategically breaks in Tokyo or Seoul?
The goal is absolute clarity here. We are examining that cause and effect in international relations.
Right.
We are moving past the political rhetoric, all the talking points, to look at the cold, hard data of how supply chains, military deployments, and historical trust are just being rewired.
Okay, let's unpack this. We need to establish the baseline first. Anyone who follows international relations has probably heard terms like the U.S. security umbrella or regional security architecture.
Sure, those get thrown around a lot.
They do. But let's talk about the actual mechanism of how this grand bargain functions day to day for these countries.
Right. So if we connect this to the bigger picture, the security architecture in the Asia-Pacific isn't just a military treaty. It's actually an economic engine.
Oh, interesting. How so?
Well, after World War II, the United States basically offered this massive continent-spanning trade-off. The U.S. provides the ultimate military protection, right? Nuclear deterrence, forward-deployed troops, naval dominance.
The big guns.
Exactly. And in exchange, the U.S. gets prime strategic real estate to project power right on the doorstep of major rivals, primarily China today.
Right, so it's not a charity project.
Yeah.
It is highly calculated strategic positioning for Washington.
Absolutely. But the mechanism for the allies is even more profound. Because countries like Japan and South Korea are protected by, well, the most powerful military in human history.
They don't have to spend massive, crippling portions of their own GDP on building giant militaries.
Exactly. They took all that capital, all that engineering brainpower, and channeled it directly into economic growth instead.
Wow.
That security umbrella is the literal foundation that allowed them to become the high-tech, export-driven powerhouses they are today. It essentially keeps the rain off so they can build the house.
But our thesis today is that under Trump's second term, this grand bargain is experiencing just unprecedented structural strain.
Yes, very much so.
And I want to be clear here. Allies argue all the time. Trade disputes happen. That's normal.
Right.
But what we are seeing now isn't a diplomatic spat. It's a fundamental degradation of trust. The allies are looking up and realizing the person holding the umbrella might just, walk away.
Yeah, that safety net feels fragile suddenly.
Exactly. And I want to take this from the abstract 30,000-foot view down to the ground level. Let's look at how this mechanism is actually breaking down in South Korea.
To understand the current friction with Seoul, you really have to understand the depth of the integration first.
Okay.
The U.S.-South Korea relationship dates all the way back to the Korean War in the early 1950s. And legally speaking, that war never actually ended.
Right. Just paused with an armistice.
Exactly. It merely paused.
Yeah.
So because South Korea faces an ever-present, literal existential threat just across the 38th parallel, the U.S. has maintained roughly 28,500 troops there continuously.
It's deeply woven into the fabric of the country's defense apparatus.
It really is.
But hey, let me push back a little here. When Trump demanded that South Korea literally multiply by 5 its financial contribution to host those troops during his first term, wasn't that just a hardball negotiation tactic?
Well,
I mean, every U.S. president asks allies to pay more for defense, right?
what's fascinating here is the difference between a tough negotiation and a structural rupture.
Okay.
Yes, administrations routinely renegotiate cost sharing, which is known over there as the Special Measures Agreement. But historically, those increases are, incremental.
Well, a few percentage points.
Right, exactly. A few points to account for inflation or maybe some new joint facilities. But demanding a 400% increase overnight, that shatters the established formula.
Because it completely changes the tone of the relationship.
Yes. It transforms a relationship based on shared democratic values and mutual defense into a strictly transactional, almost mafia-style protection racket.
Wow, yeah. Now, Biden temporarily patched that with a standard, I think it was a 13.9% negotiated increase.
He did, yes.
But in the second term, that transactional pressure returned with a vengeance. And this time, it directly targeted the South Korean economic engine.
Which brings us to the tariffs.
Yes, on what was symbolically and honestly somewhat aggressively Liberation Day in South Korea, Trump slapped a 25% tariff on South Korean goods.
A huge hit.
And I want to emphasize the real-world impact of this mechanism to you, the listener. South Korea doesn't have massive domestic oil reserves, right?
Yeah.
Or endless natural resources.
No, not at all.
Their entire wealth is generated by an export-oriented economy. They manufacture incredible things, semiconductors, memory chips, electric vehicles, and they sell them to the U.S.
And when you apply a 25% tariff to those specific supply chains, it is not a speed bump, it is a structural threat. I mean, a 25% margin erasure in the highly competitive semiconductor or auto market effectively prices South Korean goods completely out of the market. It threatens to shut down factories in Ulsan and Gyeonggi province.
And it hits your wallet, too.
Oh, absolutely.
If you are planning to buy a new smartphone or a new car, a 25% tariff on the supply chain means those costs are ultimately passed down or the supply just dries up. It's a massive disruption.
Yeah.
But it also bleeds into the social fabric, right? It's not just a spreadsheet issue. Look at the visceral reaction to the U.S. immigration raid on the Hyundai plant in Georgia.
Oh, that was a huge moment.
Over 300 Korean nationals were detained and deported.
Right, and this hit a deep cultural nerve. We really need to look at the socioeconomic context of why that stung so much.
Let's do it.
The South Korean government and its public view their overseas corporate footprint with immense national pride.
Right.
Hyundai investing billions to build an electric vehicle plant in Georgia is seen as South Korea directly contributing to the American industrial base. They're bringing jobs to the U.S.
Exactly. It's supposed to be the ultimate win-win. We get jobs, they get market access.
But then you have an aggressive immigration raid targeting the very engineers and workers sent over to set up that high-tech facility.
Yeah.
It just highlights a massive contradiction between U.S. industrial policy, which desperately wants foreign investment, and U.S. immigration enforcement.
Right.
Back in Seoul, this didn't look like routine law enforcement. It looked punitive. It felt like a public humiliation of a flagship national company.
It's friction on every single level, financial, economic, and social. But the military core of this strain is what genuinely shocked me.
The Saad situation.
Yes, we need to talk about the Todd crisis.
Yeah.
Because this perfectly illustrates the raw power dynamics at play.
Let's break down the mechanics of TOD first. It stands for Terminal High Altitude Area Defense.
Okay.
It is a highly advanced anti-ballistic missile system designed to shoot down short and medium-range missiles in their final phase of flight. But the missile interceptors themselves aren't actually the controversial part here.
It's the radar, isn't it?
Precisely. The system relies on the ANTPY-2 X-band radar. and it is incredibly powerful.
Like seeing across borders powerful.
Very much so. When the U.S. deployed, say, aid to South Korea in 2017 to defend against North Korean missiles, China vehemently objected because that radar can peer deep into Chinese airspace.
Ah, so Beijing viewed it as a direct threat to their own nuclear deterrent capabilities.
Exactly.
China retaliates, but they don't sanction the United States. They brutally punish South Korea for hosting the American system.
And the mechanism of that punishment was just devastating. China unleashed billions of dollars in unofficial economic warfare.
How so?
Well, the Lottie Group, which is a massive South Korean conglomerate, had provided the golf course land where rethink was ultimately installed.
Right.
In response, China effectively shut down 80% of Lottie Mart retail stores operating inside China. They banned Chinese tour groups from visiting South Korea, which wiped out billions in tourism revenue.
Wow.
They even blocked Korean cultural exports like K-pop, cosmetics, TV dramas from the Chinese market.
But South Korea took the hit. They absorbed billions in economic damage because they genuinely believed the TAD system was an absolute necessity to protect their citizens from North Korea.
Yeah, they sacrificed their economy for this shield.
Which brings us to the breaking point during Trump's second term and the eruption of the U.S. war with Iran in the Middle East.
Right.
The U.S. military urgently needed advanced missile defense in the Persian Gulf region. So Washington simply ordered the TAD system to be uninstalled from South Korea and physically transferred to the Middle East.
Which is wild.
It is. I was trying to figure out how to explain just how imbalanced and maddening this mechanism of alliance is. And think of it like this.
Okay.
Imagine you rent a house, and your landlord forces you to install an incredibly expensive, highly sensitive security system on the property.
All right.
Your next-door neighbor absolutely hates this system because cameras point into his yard. In retaliation, the neighbor slashes your car tires, poisons your dog, and costs you thousands of dollars in property damage.
Right. Brutal.
But you accept it because your family desperately needs the security from the rising crime in the area.
You need the cameras.
Exactly. Then, years later, the landlord just walks in, rips the security system out of the wall, and takes it to use at a different property he owns across town,
Oh, wow.
leaving you completely exposed while you still have to live next to the neighbor who hates you.
That analogy perfectly captures the strategic helplessness. I mean, South Korean President Lee Young publicly opposed the redeployment. He made it clear Seoul desperately wanted to keep it.
Yeah,
But he ultimately had to stand before his country and acknowledge that he had no legal or military authority to stop the United States from packing up the system.
that is just rough.
It was a raw, undeniable demonstration that South Korea's existential defense needs are secondary to Washington's global priorities.
Okay, so South Korea is watching its defensive shield literally get packed onto cargo planes.
Hmm.
If you're Seoul, that's a nightmare. But at least South Korea has a massive, highly capable standing army of its own.
Right.
What happens when you apply that exact same geopolitical shockwave to a country that fundamentally lacks an offensive military? How does that mechanism work?
Well, that brings us directly to Japan, where the constitutional context changes the entire equation.
Okay, let's talk about Japan.
After World War II, during the U.S. occupation, Japan adopted a pacifist constitution, specifically Article 9.
Which the U.S. heavily influenced, right? I mean, we basically wrote it.
Yes, we did. Article 9 legally renounces war as a sovereign right of the nation. It explicitly states that land, sea, and air forces, as well as other war potential, will never be maintained.
That's a huge commitment.
It is. For 70 years, Japan has essentially outsourced its ultimate national defense to the United States. Under the Security Treaty, the U.S. defends Japan, and in return, the U.S. gets massive, strategically vital bases in Okinawa and across the archipelago.
Right.
Japan does have a self-defense force, but legally and psychologically, they have historically relied almost entirely on the U.S. umbrella for fundamental survival.
So when the U.S. starts acting unpredictably, Japan has far less of a domestic safety net to fall back on.
Exactly.
And we see the same friction applied to them. Japan's export economy was blindsided by the same tariffs we talked about with Korea.
Yeah.
But it gets even more complicated diplomatically. When Japanese Prime Minister Sane Takaichi made, pretty standard diplomatic comments supporting Taiwan, China was furious.
And the U.S. offered incredibly muted support.
Exactly. They didn't publicly back Tokyo the way they historically would.
And this diplomatic strain really reached a critical mass over the U.S.-Iran war. We have to look at the energy supply chain here.
So.
Japan is an island nation with virtually zero domestic fossil fuels. They are completely dependent on the Middle East for energy.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, a massive percentage of their crude oil and liquefied natural gas must travel through the Persian Gulf and the Strait of Hormuz.
So if that strait closes, it's not just that gas prices go up at the pump. The Japanese economy grinds to an absolute halt. The manufacturing just stops.
Exactly. So Trump demands that his allies, including Japan, step up militarily and send forces to the Middle East to help keep the Strait of Hormuz open.
Makes sense from a U.S. perspective.
But Prime Minister Takaichi is caught in a legal and political vice grip. The war with Iran is deeply unpopular with the Japanese public.
Right.
And more importantly, interpreting Article 9 to allow the Japanese Maritime Self-Defense Force to deploy to an active war zone halfway across the world. That is a constitutional minefield.
So Takaichi goes into this meeting to try and explain the nuances of Japanese constitutional law, a law the U.S. helped create, by the way, and explain why they can't just, send destroyers to the Persian Gulf.
Right.
And then the ultimate diplomatic shockwave hits.
To justify why he didn't give Japan advance warning about U.S. military strikes on Iran, Trump invoked Pearl Harbor.
Here's where it gets really interesting, and I want to pause here, because if you don't live and breathe U.S.-Japan diplomatic history, bringing up Pearl Harbor might just sound like an aggressive, maybe off-the-cuff remark.
Yeah.
But why is this specific reference such a catastrophic breach of diplomatic protocol?
This raises an important question about how historical trauma functions as the bedrock of modern alliances.
All right.
Pearl Harbor isn't just a historical event. It is the most sensitive psychological wound in the U.S.-Japan relationship. The entire post-war alliance, guided by what's known as the Yoshida Doctrine, has been meticulously built on a deliberate process of reconciliation.
It's not just forgotten, it's carefully managed.
Exactly. It relies on the mutual understanding that both nations have moved past the horrors of the Pacific War and the atomic bombings.
It's the foundational trust that allows U.S. troops to be stationed in Japan in the first place.
Precisely. So for the President of the United States to use Pearl Harbor as a casual justification for keeping the Japanese Prime Minister in the dark about modern military operations, it completely unravels that 70-year framework. It sends a chilling message to Tokyo. It says, when the chips are down, I don't view you as a trusted 21st century democratic partner. I view you through the lens of a 1941 enemy.
It is literally pulling the pin out of a historical grenade and rolling it across the negotiation table.
It really is.
And the real-world military consequences followed immediately, right? The U.S. 31st Marine Expeditionary Unit, which is a premier crisis response force prominently based in Japan, was packed up and sent to the Middle East to fight the Iran war.
And on top of losing that forward-deployed capability, Japan's own military modernization was crippled.
Oh, so?
Japan had negotiated the purchase of hundreds of Tomahawk cruise missiles from the U.S. This was a massive step for their defense. But the supply chain for those munitions was completely disrupted because Washington prioritized sending everything to the Middle East.
The mechanism of defense is literally breaking down.
Yeah.
The Marines are leaving, the weapons you ordered are delayed, your economy is being tariffed, and the historical trust is being weaponized against you.
It's a perfect storm.
So what does this all mean? If you are sitting in the defense ministry in Seoul or Tokyo, and the superpower you have relied on for over half a century is suddenly distracted, demanding, and utterly unpredictable, what do you do today?
You have to react.
Right. You can't just change your geography. You are still sitting right next to an increasingly aggressive North Korea and a massive, assertive China.
This brings us to the current practices. The immediate mechanical response from these nations. In international relations, the term is hedging.
Hedging.
Right. They are furiously hedging their bets. They know they cannot afford to completely break the U.S. alliance right now. The gap in capabilities is still way too wide.
Yeah.
But they are systematically building alternative architectures.
Let's look at Japan's military diversification, because they're effectively rewriting their national identity right now. Japan is now committed to doubling its defense budget over a 5-year period. Doubling it.
To put that in perspective, moving defense spending to 2% of GDP for the world's fourth largest economy represents a staggering influx of capital.
It's massive.
It is the definitive end of the post-war pacifist status quo. They are acquiring counter-strike capabilities, building new surface combatants, and investing heavily in cyber and space domains.
But they aren't just buying hardware. They are building a new buddy system. They are deepening defense cooperation with the Philippines, Canada, and Europe.
Right.
And the centerpiece of this is the Reciprocal Access Agreement with Australia. Explain the legal mechanism of what that agreement actually does.
Historically, if Japanese troops wanted to train in Australia or vice versa, the diplomatic red tape and legal hurdles regarding weapons, liability, and jurisdiction were just a nightmare.
Bureaucracy at its worst.
Exactly. A reciprocal access agreement, or RAA, cuts entirely through that. It provides a standing legal framework that allows Japanese self-defense forces to easily and rapidly deploy to Australian territory for joint operations, and Australian troops to do the same in Japan.
So they're integrating their military so they can respond to regional crises seamlessly without needing the United States to act as the middleman or the commander.
Exactly. It is building a parallel security structure, and South Korea is undertaking a similarly radical shift, but focused internally.
Okay.
President Lee is pushing aggressively to regain wartime operational control, known as OPICON, of the South Korean military.
Which genuinely blew my mind when I realized the current structure.
It's unique, for sure.
Because in peacetime, South Korea commands its own troops.
Mm.
But the moment a war breaks out, a United States general technically assumes operational command over the entire South Korean military.
It is a unique legacy of the Korean War.
Right.
And for decades, Seoul accepted it because it guaranteed that the U.S. was fully committed.
Right.
If a U.S. general is in charge, the full weight of the U.S. military is backing them up. But now the calculus has completely inverted.
How so?
Well, if you fundamentally distrust the political decision-making in Washington, if you fear the U.S. might drag you into an unnecessary conflict or abandon you mid-fight, you cannot allow a foreign commander to have the final say over your troops in a life-or-death struggle on your own soil.
It's taking the steering wheel back.
Mm-hmm.
But that brings us back to the most staggering statistic of this entire deep dive, the nuclear question. 76.2% of South Koreans now support developing an indigenous nuclear weapon.
What's fascinating here is the mechanics of nuclear deterrence. For decades, the U.S. extended its nuclear umbrella over South Korea.
Right.
The bargain was simple. Do not build your own nuclear weapons, because doing so would trigger a massive arms race in Asia. In return, if North Korea ever attacks you with a nuclear weapon, we promise to retaliate with our own nuclear arsenal.
But deterrence only works if the enemy and the ally honestly believes you will actually pull the trigger.
Exactly.
During the Cold War, the question was always, would the U.S. trade Los Angeles for Berlin? Today, the question is, would a transactional U.S. president trade Seattle for Seoul?
Right.
If you genuinely believe the U.S. president might look at a North Korean attack and say, well, not our problem, they didn't pay us enough, then building your own nuclear weapon isn't a fringe idea anymore. It becomes the only logical mathematical choice for national survival.
And South Korea has the infrastructure to do it. They have a massive civilian nuclear power industry. They possess advanced ballistic and cruise missile delivery systems.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, if they made the political decision to break out, the timeline to develop a functional nuclear weapon would be incredibly short. The taboo is completely gone.
I was thinking about how to visualize this entire strategic shift, and it's basically the investment portfolio analogy.
Oh, I like that.
For decades, countries like Japan and South Korea put 100% of their national security investment into one single, highly reliable blue-chip stock, the United States military.
Right.
It paid incredible dividends. It allowed them to grow their economies. But suddenly, the CEO of that company becomes highly unpredictable, the board is erratic, and the stock gets incredibly volatile.
And if we connect this to the bigger picture, what does a rational financial advisor tell you in that scenario?
You don't panic sell.
You don't immediately dump all your shares of the U.S. stock because a total crash would ruin you. You still need that baseline protection. But you absolutely stop putting new capital into it.
Exactly.
You start furiously diversifying your portfolio. You buy Australian defense bonds, you invest in European mutual funds, and you start keeping a massive amount of cash under your mattress, which is building your own domestic military and having serious debates about your own nuclear weapons, just in case that blue chip stock finally goes bankrupt.
That captures the dynamic perfectly.
Yeah.
It is a methodical transition from absolute reliance to intense structural diversification. But there is a secondary consequence to this shift, and it revolves around economics.
Okay.
And this is where we uncover the ultimate geopolitical irony of this entire situation.
Right. Here's where it gets really interesting.
By heavily straining these alliances, by imposing punitive tariffs, and by triggering a massive energy shock through the Middle East conflict, the United States is inadvertently executing the exact opposite of its grand strategy.
Wait, really? Yes. It is accidentally pushing its most vital Asian allies directly into economic accommodation with its biggest global rival, China.
It is staggering. Now,
Yeah.
the entire point of the U.S. alliance network in the Pacific was to contain Chinese expansion.
Exactly.
But let's look at the mechanisms our sources highlight. The region is experiencing a severe energy shock. They need fossil fuels to keep their economies functioning, and the U.S. war in Iran is threatening the Strait of Hormuz.
Right.
So who has the leverage to help secure energy or provide alternative economic stability right now? China. Our sources point out that Australian Prime Minister Anthony Albanese recently held direct talks with Chinese Premier Li Qiang, specifically focusing on energy security cooperation.
And the economic gravity is pulling even the most resistant nations. Look at the Philippines under President Ferdinand Marcos Jr.
Yeah?
He has historically taken a highly assertive, confrontational line against China, specifically regarding the intense maritime disputes in the South China Sea. We are talking about literal ship ramming incidents and water cannons being used over territorial claims.
But despite that open, physical hostility on the water, Marcos Jr. recently gave an interview where he admitted that because of the geopolitical chaos and economic disruption emanating from the U.S., there would have to be a very, very serious restructuring of the Philippines' relations with China.
Because the math forces your hand.
Yeah.
If the United States is causing an energy crisis, delaying your military hardware and taxing your exports, and China is sitting right next door offering to buy your goods and help secure your energy supply chains, basic survival kicks in.
Right.
It is the profound irony of adopting a purely transactional approach to diplomacy. If you treat your deeply integrated allies purely as economic competitors, they will eventually act like independent economic actors.
Which means they shop around.
Exactly. They will seek better deals elsewhere to stabilize their economies, even if that means doing business with your primary strategic adversary.
So let's pull the lens back and look at the whole board here. We have dissected the deep historical foundations of these alliances. We've examined the exact mechanisms breaking them down, the devastating tariffs, the redeployment, the Pearl Harbor comments unraveling post-war reconciliation.
All of it.
And we've seen the immediate real-world reactions, the massive defense budget increases, the reciprocal access agreements, the terrifying push for nuclear breakout. Where does the Asia-Pacific actually go from here?
If we synthesize all these data points, the clearest projection is a highly conditional future.
Right.
It is vital to emphasize that the formal alliances are not collapsing tomorrow. The sources are very clear on this. Even amid all this unprecedented friction, South Koreans still prefer alignment with the United States over alignment with China by an overwhelming margin of 85.8%.
Because no matter how erratically Washington behaves, China simply isn't a viable security partner.
No, of course not.
You cannot ask the country that is actively disputing your maritime borders, flying jets into your air defense identification zones, and economically sanctioning your corporations to suddenly become your primary military protector.
Exactly. So the treaty documents will remain in place, the diplomatic photo ops will still happen, but the era of unquestioning automatic alignment with Washington is definitively over.
Yeah.
The fundamental relationship is shifting from a familial bond, where you implicitly trust the other person will sacrifice for you no matter what, to a highly conditional, heavily diversified safety net. These nations are quietly, methodically, and irreversibly building the capacity to survive without the United States.
That is a fundamental rewiring of the global map. The center of gravity is shifting. And as you, the listener, process all these shifting tectonic plates, there are a few specific areas where the sources leave us hanging.
Some critical knowledge gaps.
Exactly. Gaps that will determine what happens next.
Yeah.
If you want to keep exploring the mechanics of this shift on your own, here are 3 specific questions you should honestly dig into.
What's the first one?
First, how exactly does the Japanese government legally execute this military buildup? I'm talking about the legal gymnastics of balancing a strictly pacifist constitution, Article 9, with buying offensive weapons like Tomahawk cruise missiles.
Oh, that's a good one.
Right? How does the Cabinet Legislation Bureau in Tokyo creatively reinterpret the law to make that permissible without triggering a full constitutional crisis?
That is a fascinating rabbit hole of legal and political maneuvering.
Yeah.
The second question you should explore relates to the mechanics of nuclear proliferation. Could South Korea actually build a nuclear weapon given the strict international non-proliferation treaties, the NPT, they have signed?
Because breaking that is a big deal.
Huge. Breaking out of the NPT usually triggers immediate crushing global sanctions. Is the South Korean economy prepared to absorb that, or is that 76% polling number just a hollow threat meant to shock Washington into paying attention?
And third, look into the supply chains. If the Strait of Hormuz remains violently contested because of the U.S.-Iran war, what alternative energy routes can the Asia-Pacific actually rely on to keep the lights on?
Right.
Are there new liquid natural gas pipelines,
Yeah.
alternative maritime routes, avoiding the Malacca dilemma, or a massive acceleration toward green energy that can replace that flow of Middle Eastern oil fast enough to prevent a total economic collapse in Tokyo and Seoul?
Those are exactly the logistical nightmares that defense planners and energy ministers across the Asia-Pacific are losing sleep over right now.
Seriously,
And as we wrap up this deep dive, I want to leave you with one final provocative thought to mull over.
let's hear it.
We have spent this entire time talking about a binary world, right? The US versus China. But what if the long-term result of all this friction isn't simply China taking over the region? What if the actual future is the creation of a massive, leaderless web of middle power alliances? Imagine a future in 10 or 15 years where Japan, South Korea, Australia, and the Philippines have fully integrated their militaries and economies,
Wow.
forming a unified, highly advanced defense network that simply doesn't need Washington to function anymore. A self-sustaining, heavily armed Asia-Pacific bloc that dictates terms to both Beijing and Washington.
Now, that would truly change the map. Think back to that world map we talked about at the very beginning.
Yeah.
The lines aren't fading. They're just being aggressively redrawn in real time, right before our eyes, far away from where the loudest headlines are shouting.
Absolutely.
We want to thank you so much for joining us on this deep dive into the changing geopolitical and economic ties of the Asia-Pacific. Keep your magnifying glass handy, keep questioning the consensus, and we will see you next time.